The Quo-Cast, a Status Quo fan podcast.
This is Jamie Dyer welcoming you to another edition of The Quo-Cast. And if you'd like to be a guest on a future edition of the podcast, then you can. You can email quocast@outlook.com. That's quocast@outlook.com. You can tweet at castquo on Twitter, or you can go to the Facebook page, which is just simply The Quo-Cast. So whatever your connection to the band, I would love to hear from you. So in this episode, I wanted to focus on a particular album from Quo's history. And today, I have chosen their 1970 album, Mark Kelly's Greasy Spoon. The album that pretty much kick-started a whole new direction after the two psychedelic albums of the late 60s. And it was recently re-released on fried egg vinyl. And I haven't seen it myself in person, but from the pictures, it does look very fetching indeed. And the album cover is always one that's very striking, and I know that Rick and Francis have both said about this album, the lady that they got to pose for that photo just had the right mood about it, you know, the idea of a greasy spoon, and the fact that this album is quite rough around the edges. The guitar parts, they're just getting into the roles in which Quo would later become known for. And it kick-started what you might call the golden age, I suppose, although most people tend to think of the golden age as being from Pile Driver onwards. But this one and Dog of Two Head on Pi Records are both extremely interesting albums. This one because of all the experimentation that is going on. Now, in preparation for this podcast, I asked people's opinions, and there are people that absolutely love this album, and there are others that don't like specific tracks. And I saw a comment on something recently for the track Everything, which is a cello and Rick singing and little snatches of guitar in between, and it's probably the most stripped down track that they have ever recorded. And I think it's beautiful, but some people think it's the worst track they ever did. But maybe that's because it doesn't really conform with the image that Quo would later amass. So there are loads of fans that think it's fantastic, and people like Leighton have said that it was a really good shift in direction, and the foundation was laid down in vinyl for the rise of the Frantic Four. And the thing is, this is the last album to feature Roy Lyons on keyboards and piano and all sorts of things that he was doing there. And it's, you know, I could see what he was thinking when he thought, well, I'm not really needed anymore, or they're kind of going in their own direction and it's going into a different phase. But he does some great playing on this album. The frantic, to use that word, the frantic keyboard playing on well, it's an organ, isn't it? On Is It Really Me, Gotta Go Home is great. I love it, you know, it's excellent. So yeah, lots of people are saying that it was the start of Quo's adventure into boogie, and as David points out, it's quite quirky in places now. And I wonder what kind of sparked that thinking, David. I would love to know. And Rob wrote on Facebook, with the benefit of hindsight, this was a brave diversion and provides an indication of the blueprint of what was to become perhaps the most signature sound of all the great rock bands during the golden period. And of course, Paul kind of goes along the same line with this album followed on from Down the Dustpipe, the first boogie-type song that Quo recorded. Spinning Wheel Blues and Junior's Wailing are like the template for the Quo boogie sound which we all love. And I find that an interesting observation, because Junior's Wailing is a cover version, and a very good one at that. Now, before I read out some further comments, let me just read out the track listing for this album, because we've talked about it being particularly kind of groundbreaking in that it introduced this new sound, this new direction, which they wanted to go in after the psychedelic albums. But tell me what you think when you think of these song titles: Spinning Wheel Blues, Daughter, Everything, Shy Fly, April, Spring, Summer and Wednesdays, Junior's Wailing, Lucky Lady, Need Your Love, Lazy Poker Blues, Is It Really Me, Gotta Go Home. Now, I agree with the previous comment that said that they were quite quirky in places. Like Lucky Lady, for example, is very quirky, as is Shy Fly. I love the lyrics, the kind of cryptic lyrics that are within there. And I have a new appreciation for Daughter, which is kind of heavy and in that kind of psychedelic / rock mold, you know, one that's very underrated in my opinion. And of course, April, Spring, Summer and Wednesdays, which has a very long history with the Quo. It's a track that they played on the Frantic Four tour, for example, and it's one that they've snuck in now and again elsewhere, and it was sampled as well by Groove Armada in the late 2000s with Francis Rossi playing that guitar part for them. It's a fantastic riff, isn't it? And it really sounded good live. Darren points out that this album is instantly recognizable. He said, awesome, almost raw, unpolished sound. And it's his favorite Quo album. And Tim kind of follows on from there with creative, original, diverse and accomplished. Quite how it wasn't a hit, or more well known to non-Quo classic rock fans, he doesn't know. And this is the one that he would recommend to people who like music and think they know Quo. And that's the thing with this, is there are a couple of tracks in there that are typical Quo perhaps, but that slowed down, slightly unpolished, and I would say it's not really accomplished. Like the solo on Lucky Lady, it sounds like Francis is just getting to grips with the idea of the solo. It's not really confident, but it probably is accomplished in other ways. And Amy, who is a regular listener and supporter of the podcast, said she loves this album. It's raw Quo developing their own style, and Spinning Wheel Blues as the standout for her. And I have to say, it's one I enjoy playing, both off the record and when I pick up the guitar sometimes. It's a great slow but a blues kind of melodic number, sort of mid-tempo actually rather than slow. And I know there is a performance from, I want to say it's Doing Their Thing, and on the YouTube video that's up there, people say that John Coughlin looks like he's bored. And it's like, no, he's just a good, solid blues drummer. You know, keeping that kind of shuffle thing going as best he can, and he can do it wonderfully. Now, I suppose in hindsight, when you look at the track listing on this album, there are 2 or 3 glaring omissions here. The fact that Down the Dustpipe and In My Chair aren't included. Now, Down the Dustpipe, as has already been said, was the first kind of boogie rock sound for the band in the studio, because if you think about tracks like Bloodhound that they were playing before, and some of the more kind of boogie orientated tracks on the stage, even when they were a psychedelic band, Down the Dustpipe is, as far as I know, the first boogie song to be on record, as in the studio, for the band, and it's missing from this album, which is a shame and a surprise, but maybe they found that it didn't really fit with the tone after all. Down the Dustpipe is something of an experimentation, so it hasn't quite made the mark, I suppose. Then you've got In My Chair, which was released a couple of months after Mark Kelly's Greasy Spoon, and again is different, it's slow, it's very bluesy. I suppose it would have worked relatively well with the likes of, I don't know, Lazy Poker Blues, the Fleetwood Mac cover. But it's different, and that's the thing with these years between 1970 and 72, is that you're getting all of this experimentation, and it's getting closer and closer and closer. And the fact that these tracks were left off in retrospect, it sounds like a terrible idea. Why would you do that? But then it made sense in a business sense. You used to have non-album singles, for example, Tune to the Music being the other one that springs to mind. But both Down the Dust Pipe, In My Chair, and, of course, Tune to the Music have been included on subsequent remastered versions of these albums. So they made it eventually. So I'll end this podcast here, but I'll say, what do you think of Mark Kelly's Greasy Spoon? Do you think that, like many fans, it is that foundation of which the band started to hone their sound? Or do you think, actually, I kind of lumber it in with the psychedelic albums, in that a couple of tracks are okay, but it's not the best for me as an individual? Whatever your opinion, I would love to hear from you. And from me, Jamie Dyer, I'll say bye-bye for now.